It's day 8, Monday the 23rd of January, and the sun is probably about 20 minutes from setting. It's setting to the west behind some clouds. The weather's definitely changing. You know, if you remember the last few podcasts, we've been plodding across an enormous plain, having left some mountain ranges behind, but the biggest mountain range of all looms probably about 2 days ahead of us, the Hijaz Mountains that rise up to about 6,000 feet. Nestling on the inland side of those is the hill country of the hill sort of community of Taif, the community, so look forward to seeing that in a few days' time. And then we will descend the seaward side, the western side of those mountains into Jeddah. I think about this time next week when our journey across Arabia comes to an end. But we're camped tonight, overlooking another vast plain, which actually is an old riverbed. We just bumped into an old Bedouin chap this afternoon who informed us that it rained here 15 days ago. And if you scratch away the sand at a depth of about 4 or 5 inches, you can find evidence of that. The sand gets very heavy and very dark. And there is 1 or 2 signs of grass starting to grow, but really superficially it looks as if it hasn't rained here for many, many, many years. In the distance there's a line of mountains. We found a little bit of shelter. The wind has dropped, but certainly the weather seems to be changing with quite a few clouds gathering, although I don't think we're in for any rain. But we're on the southwest side of this last great physical barrier, other than the Hijaz Mountains, the last great barrier that Philby faced and we faced, really, which is the Uruq Sabai, this huge area of sand. And these dunes, about 70 miles long, 15 miles wide. These are the biggest dunes outside of the Rub al Khali, much further to the south and the east. They are enormous mountains of sand, and we, like Philby, anticipated quite a few problems crossing, which was why we camped just on the edge of them yesterday. We'd run out of daylight really to attempt to cross, and really that was not the time of day to get stuck and have to push and get sand ladders out. So we spent the night tucked up in a little relatively sheltered spot, which turned out to be one of the best campsites we have had. Absolutely beautiful, a gorgeous view, sheltered from the wind, lovely and sandy. Extraordinary stars. There's no moon at all last night or the night before, so the stars were spectacular last night, and very relaxing evening. Temperatures rose. Was able to lie back in my sleeping bag last night with my body half out of it and just stare at the stars, and rather than burying my head inside trying to keep warm, as I have been over the last week or two. But calm night. Reem's camera trap paid dividends last night. The tin of tuna, smelly tuna, did its bit. Lots of fox tracks around the small bush where Reem had hidden her camera trap, and sure enough all the tuna had gone. So hopefully we'll get some pretty good images of a fox getting stuck into a pile of tuna at some point from the team at Coust. So as I lay in my bag this morning, I was looking, really craning my neck. I couldn't quite see the southern sky. I was looking for the Southern Cross, so I'll have a look tonight. I'm probably better positioned tonight to see it. But the first noise I heard, it was totally silent all night. Beautiful, really powerful silence. Was a bird starting to call in what I thought was darkness. I drifted off to sleep and slept a bit fitfully during the night, but when I groped around and found my watch, it was about 5 a.m. It's still an hour or so before sunrise. But you know what, the hoopoe larks, there's a particular species of bird here that runs around a little bit like a mini roadrunner, and like our skylark in Britain that lives in flat open country, it flies high to get a view to look around for predators. Exactly. The hoopoe larks fly up and come down with a beautiful whistling call, and they were starting to call well before I couldn't detect any change in the light looking in the east where the sun was about to rise, but they clearly can, and they start calling quietly to each other, and then getting louder and louder and more joined in as the light does slowly increase. And Alan and I walked on top of the hill above camp and watched the most beautiful sunrise this morning before descending down for breakfast. Reem and I then headed off for a few more kilometres and hours under the belt. Anna had the drone up doing some filming, so a lovely morning. But actually our passage through this barrier was made relatively easy by our friends at the gold mine that we drove past last of all yesterday afternoon, who'd cleared a track through one of the easier passes between the dunes. Perhaps a bit of a contribution, a social contribution to the local community, for whom the dunes would present a huge challenge to have to drive around. So they've helped clear a track part way through, which we followed, and here we are on the other side safely without anything happening untoward, which was great. So we've been looking. So we reconnected then with Philby's line. Philby crossed these dunes a little bit further north than we did. We then drove north when we popped through the dunes to reconnect with his line, and he spoke about an old fort that guarded a particular waterhole, and we've spent this afternoon visiting a couple of old waterholes that we could find, but all of them were dry, no water, and no sign of any fort. Philby did say it was fairly dilapidated when he saw it. But for him and his team, now this was he's really into Neki country, because he's now in the land of the tribes that support Sharif Hussein of Mecca, and this was why he's doing this journey, travelling under the protection of Ibn Saud, to prove to Ibn Saud that he did have the allegiance of the tribes, and it was possible to travel safely all the way to the coast to Jeddah. But Philby, for the last few weeks when terrain, or last few days when terrain has allowed, he's been choosing his campsites hidden away, out of sight, because he doesn't want to attract attention of the local tribal people. But out here in these enormous plains, he has absolutely no choice. There is nowhere to hide. Now that has advantages, because it means that you can see who's coming. You're not going to get spooked by surprise. And he writes about this in his book, The Heart of Arabia. And he says, we were now clear of the dangers lurking in the folds of the highlands. In the daytime, no foe could now approach us without timely warning of his presence. But at night, no friendly shelter concealed the campfire from prowling brigands, should any be about. For 4 days since leaving Kasariya behind us, we had seen no living soul, and really we've probably only seen about half a dozen people over the last 4 or 5 days. I think we've crossed 1 or 2 roads, but we've been off-road for 4 or 5 days solid, covering a couple of 100 kilometres, just an amazingly remote country. But he's seen no living soul. But in the morning of the day just ended, droppings of sheep gone by some day or two before had been observed, arguing the not too distant presence of shepherd folk. So he's got to be careful. There's nowhere to hide, and he also stopped in those dunes where we stopped last night before he set to crossing. And it was sitting around the fire. They had a couple of incidents that really made him travel from here on with much greater caution. Sitting around the fire, he says, the idle banter froze upon our lips as a low, long wail pierced the darkness around us. "Hark, a wolf," said one. "There, he howls again." Or perhaps, said another, a Saluki hound of some shepherd camp, but is very near, and we saw no sign of human life at sundown. "Nay," said a third, "it's the sign of a scout calling to his gang. We've been spotted." So the fire was quickly extinguished, and the party scattered to their arms, while the Rafiqs, so their guides, the Rafiq was always someone from the local tribe who would be sent forth to barter, while the Rafiq strode forth to the 4 corners of the camp, and one after another proclaimed our whence and whither to the silent night. Watches were set for the night, And next morning, searchers found the tracks of the wolf, which had alarmed us in the near vicinity of the camp. So wolves around then, not so much here today. The wolves are doing really well back where I live in southern Oman. They seem to be thriving, whilst small farmsteads, and I'm talking just a tent with a wire cage, but some goats, and that's all awful for wolves and animals like that. So the top field ecologists who operate in southern Oman, so that's people like Andrew Spalton, Hadi Hikmani, and his brother Khalid Hikmani. They spend their lives studying the wolves and the mammals, the larger mammals down there. So wolves seem to be doing really well. I came sadly across one that was dead on the road last year or the year before, I think, but its pelt and its body was a really healthy animal, other than the fact that it was dead. So wolves are doing well. Striped hyena also doing really, really well, again for the same reasons as the wolf, we think, in that there's more to scavenge as the populations grow slightly in the hills around the city of Salalah in southern Oman. But I know the top of the food chain in southern Arabia, in southern Oman anyway, is the Arabian leopard. And I'm not sure how many are left in the mountains of Dhofar. I think maybe between 50 and 80, but I'm not the expert. Andrew and Khalid and Hadi are. But I know the three of those are now here in Saudi Arabia more and more, working on a project supported by an organisation called Panthera. And this project is trying to identify whether the Arabian leopard still exists at all here in Saudi Arabia. And they've set up hundreds of camera traps along the south of Saudi, along the border with Yemen, where the country is pretty good, pretty quiet. The likelihood of being hunted is much reduced. And these camera traps have thrown up plenty of evidence of wolves, which is good, plenty of evidence of hyenas, which is good, but absolutely no evidence of Arabian leopard, sadly. So it seems like the leopard, like the ostrich to which we referred a couple of podcasts ago, have sadly disappeared from the plains of Arabia, as did the oryx many years ago. But the oryx has been successfully reintroduced, and what was going to be a conservation project is now going to be a sort of reintroduction project. And I think Andrew and Hadi and Khalid and the team, they'll be now looking at how can they successfully establish a reintroduction program to bring the Arabian leopard back to Saudi Arabia. But for Philby, these sands, other than a physical barrier, all of a sudden took on a rather more sinister tone. So he just arrived in advance of his the baggage train, and they were plodding ahead of the group and toiling up a long sandy slope, and he said, "Around us rolled a sea of sand, utterly desolate in its emptiness. The leaders suddenly drew up. 'Sadiq!' they shouted in different keys. We were with them before we realised what had happened, and found ourselves covered at a range of 20 yards by a dozen rifles. For all of our precautions, we had walked straight into an ambush. Our rifles slung to our saddle frames, unloaded, and we were completely at the mercy of our surprisers, while the main body, still far behind us, was hurrying up at its best speed. In the meantime, there was nothing to be done but to hold up our hands under the menace of these ominous barrels and to parley with the foe. There then arose a hubbub such as I have seldom heard. 3 or 4 of our opponents, ill-clad and bareheaded, rose from their cover of bushes, while the rest ceased not to cover us. Of the negotiations which ensued, everybody shouting at the top of his voice, and all together, to me not a single word was intelligible. The Rafiqs, who had all been behind, now came up and advanced into the forefront of the wordy melee. Salam alaikum, walaikum assalam. The words of peace were spoken, and the tension was over. "Come on with me," said Sard, and I followed him obediently aside, while friend and foe gathered on the summit of the ridge to fraternise. "Let us halt here for the night," said Ibrahim, and I yielded, but with little murmuring, as there was little hope of our now reaching the further edge of the sands. We and our erstwhile enemy camped side by side in adjoining hollows. I suggested that we might invite them to share our evening meal, but my proposal was negatived. In the first place, it was still unknown to them that the party they had just ambushed contained an Englishman, and the discovery of an infidel amongst us might cause them regrets at the moderation they had exercised in the moment of their undisputed ascendancy, and would certainly be blazoned abroad by them on their onward journey, perhaps to our undoing. In the second place, we had naught but rice and dates in our larder, while they were known to have a sheep. These arguments were unanswerable, and I rested content with the reflection that my identity was not as obvious to strangers as I assumed it must be. They were a small party, a dozen all told, of merchants with carriers and guides returning home from the community of Kurma, that's where we're heading tomorrow, with foreign merchandise imported through the Hijaz Mountains. They were more wary in their progress than ourselves. They had been warned by their scouts of the approach of what they took to be a raiding party, which was us, whose numbers left them little hope of successful resistance in the event of an attack. So they had accordingly decided to secure the initiative for themselves and the advantage of position. For the rest, they had put their trust in God, and determined to sell their lives and their goods as dearly as it might be. So, such are the daily anxieties and dangers of the desert. For day after day we had marched warily enough, ever on the lookout, but an hour or two before we had been warned to be on the alert, yet at the critical moment we were off our guard, and in other circumstances might have paid dearly for our fault. So I don't think such challenges lie in store for us tonight, thankfully. Tomorrow, on we plod. Reem and I, the alarm will go off at 6:30 before sunrise. Reem and I will make forward progress for the community of Kurma. We think we might reach there just before sunset tomorrow, and we may set up camp and travel into the Bedouin community there to see if we can get some water and some food, and then come back to our campsite. So, making good progress. This, I think, is day 8 now, so we're at day 8 out of 14, and so we're over halfway. I think in the psychology of expeditions, this is always the sort of quieter time. I always liken expeditions to marathons. You know, the first 5 miles you barely know you're running because of all the excitement. The last 5 you put on a sprint because you can smell the finishing line. But it's that sort of third quarter. The second quarter you're into a routine, but the third quarter where we are now, kind of 75% of the way through our entire journey, that's the bit where you start to get tired, where the finishing line is still a wee way ahead, but everybody's doing really well. Anna's on the mend, still like me croaking a bit, but we're doing okay. Tomorrow we'll see us near the community of Kurma. That'll be Tuesday. I think Thursday we will be on the outskirts of Taif, on the edge of those enormous Hijaz mountains. So we're going to try and enjoy as much as we can the solitude and the peace of the desert before we approach the coastal communities of, the mountain community of Taif, and then the bright lights of Jeddah. You know, a coastal city with several million inhabitants. So that's going to be very, very different from where we are tonight. The sun has set. I can't see a light in any direction, but it's going to be very different to that in 5 or 6 days' time.